dignity, and honor of the native princes as our own. Lord Canning reassured them against possible extinction of their dynasties by issuing 150 adoption sannads recognizing their adopted heirs. 130, but that did not mean that the Indian states were to be left unreformed, as the British often assumed a greater responsibility for the welfare of the princely subjects. The Raj, therefore, argues Ian Copeland, dedicated to grooming the princes as natural allies. This reformist became a dominant official policy with the coming of Lord Mayo, 1869–72, as Viceroy. He discovered a certain breakdown of Durbarate authority, which contributed to the collapse of law and order in many states. But the latter could be given political support only in return for good government. He was also supported in this mission by the Young Turks in the political department, who continued to put subtle and often not so subtle pressure on the princes to reform their regimes. Most of the indigenous rulers gave in, and those who chose to resist were rudely reminded of the omnipotence of the paramount power. Mulhar Rao Gaikwad of Baroda, the most important of them, was deposed in 187–5 on charges of gross misrule. But reform and modernization also had its political costs, and this became evident towards the end of the 1870s when nationalism gradually began to surface in British Indian politics. Lord Lytton, therefore, considered the princes to be the true representatives of traditional India and the natural leaders of the Indian people. But they were also to be reminded of the grandeur of British power and be placed within the imperial order, which at this stage, as we have seen, Chapter 2.1, was being institutionalized into an elaborate hierarchy. This association with the princes also gave the Raj some amount of legitimacy, and that was another reason why this relationship was duly incorporated into the imperial rituals, such as the Imperial Durbar of January 1877 and the Table of Gun Salutes. By the 20th century, the King Emperor was entitled to 101 gun salutes, the Viceroy 31, and the more important 113 Indian princes somewhere between 21 and 9 gun salutes. To maintain the pecking order, the minor princes were entirely denied this imperial honor. On the other hand, during the period 1878–86, the states had to withstand systematic intervention and contraction of their domestic sovereignty. They had to relinquish control over the railway tracks and other communication systems within their territories, although they had to pay for their construction, refrain from exporting salt to other parts of British India and accept British Indian currency as legal tender. This interventionism reached its height during the administration of Lord Curzon, 1898–1905. He, on the one hand, recognized the princes as integral parts of imperial organization and invited them with due honor to the Grand Coronation Durbar of 1903. But, on the other hand, he also brought them under stricter control. In 1900 he prohibited their foreign travel. In 1902 he pressurized the Nizam of Hyderabad to sign a more favorable treaty regarding the https:// administration of Berar. He forced the princes to pay more for the imperial service troops, deposed a number of rulers and brought 63 states under temporary British administration. No wonder, as Scindia of Gwalior later confessed, that the princes simply hated the tyranny of Curzonian paternalism. The shackles of paramountcy, as Copeland describes the situation, were eased somewhat as Lord Minto took over as the viceroy and found the princes effective and willing allies in his fight against political extremism. As a quid pro quo, he promised to respect their internal autonomy, and in an historic speech at Udaipur on November 1, 1909, announced his new policy of laissez-faire. However, the officers in the political department often did not share the viceroy's wisdom. If the new policy was meant to isolate the states from the political currents then sweeping British India, it was meant to be subordinate isolation. And things remained like that until the outbreak of World War I, which once again brought in a policy change vis-a-vis the princely states. One important question remains to be answered at this stage, and that is about the rights and obligations of the princes under the paramountcy and how were they supervised by the overbearing residents. The responsibilities and privileges of the princes were in all cases defined in treaties between them and the company, the obligations of the latter being inherited subsequently by the crown. The provisions of these treaties varied according to the circumstances in which they were signed, the status of the princes and the size of their states, but there were certain generalities too, and the treaties in many cases were later revised as well to bring in more uniformity. To begin with, all the princes recognized the company and later the crown as the suzerain power, relinquished their right to enter into diplomatic relations with or declare war against any other state or to employ any other European or American, agreed to direct all their communications with the outer world through the British agents, pay for a contingent of imperial service troops and contribute militarily when there was need for military assistance for the defense of the empire. They had to relinquish sovereignty over the railway tracks running through their territories, and share control over post and telegraph and other communication systems with the Raj. In return, they were to be protected against external aggression and internal revolt, and enjoy internal autonomy. They maintained small police forces for enforcing law and order and spent very little on public facilities for their subjects, such as healthcare or education. If some states did spend on modernizing such institutions as a status, and if some other larger states like Baroda, Mysore, Travancore, or Cochin, introduced some constitutional changes, they were exceptions, rather than the rule. However, the internal autonomy of the princes was in practice seriously constrained by the overbearing
However, the internal autonomy of the princes was in practice seriously constrained by the overbearing presence of the residents in
the case of larger states and the political agents to the Governor-General in the cases of smaller states. The resident, as Michael Fisher defines his position, stood at the intersection between the indigenous rulers and the British. 134 They controlled all communications between the two and from time to time exerted the supremacy of the latter over the former. He often tried to promote good government in the states, gave solicited and often unsolicited advice to the rulers on various internal matters and sought to control all important appointments, particularly those of the ministers through whom this informal but not so subtle control was exerted. Often they took advantage of the minority status of the rulers to extend their direct control over the affairs of the states through councils of regency. These residents and agents were members of either the Foreign Department of the Government of India, or the Political Department of the Bombay government. In 1914, the Foreign Department was split into two, a political department looked after the Indian states and a foreign department concentrated on the frontier regions and the Persian Gulf states. P. Although the political department, for various historical reasons, did not attract men of high intellectual capabilities, 136. It was on their personalities and attitudes that the nature of such interventions actually depended. Often they stretched official policies to suit their visions of supervisory role, and sometimes even openly deviated from them. It is true that the princes also tried to co-opt, appropriate, and manipulate the political officers to their advantage. Sometimes they used the organizational divisions within the British administration to retain their autonomy. Some even resisted the intrusive residence and the presumptuous paramount power. One such example was Mulhar Rao of Baroda mentioned earlier. Another glaring example was Salah Jung, the ambitious Anglophile minister of the Nizam of Hyderabad, who not only proclaimed Hyderabad's status of a semi-independent ally of the British Crown, and asserted his master's rights over Berar, but also resisted an uneconomical railway project thrust upon him by the British for military reasons. But with his death in February 1883, paramount power was asserted again in Hyderabad in its full vehemence. Most other lesser princes succumbed to the relentless pressures of the representatives. Paramountcy even without any semblance of resistance. As Bardi Ray puts it, within a few decades since Lord Canning and Sir Charles Wood at the India Office gave a new orientation to the Rajas policy to the Indian states, their status changed from semi-independent allies of the company, into feudatories of the Crown. 13s The colonial intrusion into the ways of governance in princely India also brought significant changes in the existing social equilibrium in the states, as the previous balance of power was continually redefined under the new regimes. Such social change, however, took different directions in different regions. In the case of Saroi, a small kingdom in Rajasthan, Dennis Vidal, 1997, has shown how a dynamic system of power sharing in the Durbar between the ruler and the nobles belonging to various lineages within the dominant clan was disturbed by the colonial intervention in favor of the ruler, and so was disturbed the relationship between the ruler and the mercantile groups, who were systematically marginalized from the state administration. As the ruler tried to assert his authority, with the patronage of the British, the other groups resisted. The nobles did not like their jagirs being surveyed for higher revenues, and the merchants detested the various judicial reforms that went against their interest. But their traditional means of resistance were now delegitimized or indeed criminalized and suppressed, sometimes even with armed intervention. Such crises could not be solved as they were in the past to the satisfaction of all the parties, affecting in the process the interconnections between different sections of the local population. 139 An almost similar situation could be seen in Alwar, also in Rajasthan, where the local ruler in the process of erecting the structures of a modem centralist state ruptured his traditional relationship with the Rajput elites. The latter were reduced from their status of Kasharas of power to that of subordinate subjects. 140 On the other hand, in the far south, in the state of Travancore, we come across a different kind of reorientation of the balance of social power. Pressurized by the Madras government, which in turn was being continually prodded by the Christian missionaries, Travancore since the 1860s underwent an elaborate program of modernization, executed energetically by a versatile Diwan, T. Madhav Rao. This involved, among other things, the introduction of STEM education, the state services being thrown open to talent, and finally the establishment of the Sri Malam Popular Assembly to curtail the political influence of the Palace Code rise. This cut into the power structure of Travancore and by early 20th century had far-reaching social consequences, marking the beginning of, to use Robin Jeffrey's words, a movement from inherited to achieved status. In other words, the existing caste society was given a thorough shake-up, as the dominance of the heirs in state politics, their near monopoly over administrative positions and other sinews of power were now effectively challenged by the upwardly mobile enterprising Dalit groups like the Ezavas and the local Syrian Christians. The local societies in the princely states continually experienced the encounter of two contending systems of values. The one authorized by the power of the colonial state threatened to displace the locally rooted traditions and tended to alter the social structure in a more fundamental way than we sometimes allow. 2.5 Empire and economy. We have already seen how over the years in the late 18th and the early 20th centuries the colonial state had been perfecting its system of surplus extraction from the agricultural economy of India. Now another question remains to be discussed, a question that has been so intensely debated by historians: did India under British rule experience any economic development at all? As an entry point to this discussion, we may first look at India's economic obligations to the empire and how did it fulfill them. It has been argued that it was after the pacification of the revolt of 1857, that the classical colonial economic relationship between Britain and India gradually emerged. 142 The Indian Empire was supposed to pay for itself, and at the same time the country's resources were meant to be available in the imperial cause. India had to provide a market for Britain's manufactured goods, and serve as a source of agricultural raw materials. Till the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, India fulfilled many of her imperial obligations successfully. It served as a major market for British industries like cotton, iron and steel, railways, machinery, etc. At the time of World War I, Indians consumed 85% of cotton piece goods produced at Lancashire, and 17% of British iron and steel production was absorbed by the Indian Railways. 143 Until World War I, there was no import duty, which could possibly offer any sort of protection to any of the Indian industries, and this was, as A.K. Bugchi has noted, quite contrary to the trend in the rest of the world, including the British dominions. 144 Even after 1919, when policies were meant to change under the Fiscal Autonomy Convention, successive recommendations of the Indian tariff boards to raise cotton duties were successfully thwarted by the Lancashire lobby, which fought for our rights in India, which was HTT. Considered to be an important imperial asset. 145 Apart from that, India was also a field for British capital investments in railways and agency houses. The government of India had to ensure the payment of interests on guaranteed railway stock and debt bonds and meet its annual home charges. This invariably increased India's public debt. On the other hand, India's export trade with other countries helped Britain to overcome its own problems of balance of payment deficit with them, particularly with Europe and North America. Finally, Britain could use the Indian Army to maintain its far-flung empire across the world, the entire expenses being borne by the Indian taxpayers. Military expenditure had been the greatest single burden on Indian revenues, accounting for almost one-third of the budget. 146 No wonder, India was considered to be the most precious jewel in the imperial crown of the British monarch. In the process of fulfilling these imperial obligations, India was being drained out of her wealth, so complained the early nationalists. There were several pipelines through which this drainage allegedly occurred, and these were interest on foreign debt incurred by the East India Company, military expenditure, guaranteed interest on foreign investments in railways, irrigation, road transport, and various other infrastructural facilities, the government purchase policy of importing all its stationery from England, and finally, home charges or paying for the Secretary of State and his establishment at the India Office in London, as well as pay, pension, and training costs for the civilian and military personnel or the men who ruled India. The actual transfer of money took place through the sale of council bills, which were sold in London in sterling to purchasers of Indian goods who received Indian rupees in exchange. It was often pointed out by the votaries of empire that the phenomenon of drainage was exaggerated. A modem historian would put the amount of drainage at £7 million per annum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and point out that this represented less than 2% of the value of India's exports of commodities in that period. 147 But though a small amount, as the Indian nationalist Dada Bhai Naoroji argued, what was being drained out was potential surplus that could generate more economic development if invested in India. 148 The other imperial argument was that some of this expenditure was to encourage economic development in India in the way it had happened in the West. India was brought into the larger capitalist world market, and that was in itself a progress towards modernization. Much of the foreign loans and investments were for the development of infrastructure, for integrating markets and, therefore, for the modernization of the Indian economy itself. Some of the recent historical writings point out that the fact still remains that India was not transformed into a full-fledged capitalist economy. As in the case of agrarian economy, so also in other sectors, British policies failed to foster growth. And this was due to the colonial nature of those policies, i.e., the policy of gearing up the colonial economy to the needs of the economy of the mother country. To what extent British policies can be held responsible for macroeconomic changes in India remains, however, a contentious issue, as a revisionist view claims that on the whole colonial India experienced positive economic growth. But this growth, it is admitted, varied widely in both time and space. In other words, there were periods of growth, for example, 1860 to 1920, and regions of prosperity, such as Punjab, coastal Madras, and western Uttar Pradesh, and a generalist view of colonial policies cannot explain these regional and periodic variations. But where stagnation prevailed, it was to a large extent because the government did not do as much as it should have by investing in resource generation, such as irrigation, education, and health care. The revisionist view acknowledges that it was the presence or absence of these critical resources, which determined regional development or lack of it. 149 So what was the track record of the colonial state in matters of generating resources in India? There was, first of all, limited colonial initiative to develop agricultural production, except the construction of some irrigation canals in parts of northern, northeastern, and southwestern India, i.e., in non-permanent settlement areas where there was scope for enhancing land revenue rates. It is possible to argue that between 1900 and 1939, the area under irrigation almost doubled, but that was only in absolute terms. In relative terms, in 1947 when the British Empire ended its long career in India, only a quarter of the total cropped area was under public irrigation system. While we may try to put the blame on technological bottlenecks, social issues, and local power rivalries for this lack of progress in extending irrigation facilities, the real reason was that public investment in this sector was guided only by the profitability factor and extreme contingencies, such as prevention of famines. 150 So public irrigation facilities remained hopelessly inadequate, creating only a few pockets of relative prosperity, and even in those areas, irrigation favored only the more prosperous among the peasantry, as canal rates were very high. As Imran Ali has shown for Punjab, the canal colonies became the model of commercial agriculture in Asia, but the new prosperity that accrued even after paying high water rates was shared only by limited social groups, such as a few agricultural castes and some medium and large-sized landlords, while the poor continued to labor as tenants at will. So in general, although the development of irrigation resulted in some improvement in productivity and some other technological innovations, these profited only the privileged peasants and helped the production of cash crops in certain pockets. It is difficult to dispute the fact that in the aggregate agricultural yields were largely static in colonial India, and between 1920 and 194-7, especially the production of food crops lagged far behind the rate of population growth. Near famine conditions were therefore not rarities in India during the British period, and in 1943 2 to 3 million people perished in a major famine in Bengal.